The dust was the first thing. It was not dust as she had known it. The gray soot of Boston streets. This was a fine red powder that coated every surface, that worked its way through the seams of the stagecoach, that settled on her damp skin. It tasted of iron and ages. Eliza Hart sat very still, her hands clasped tight in her lap. The heat was a physical weight, pressing the dark wool of her traveling suit against her. It was the late 1870s, and the Arizona-New Mexico territory was in the grip of a drought so fierce it felt biblical. The land outside the window was baked red and cracked, the skeletal remains of mesquite and cholla clinging to a desperate, thorny life. At 20 years old, Eliza was, by the standards of the East, a confirmed spinster. She had never been courted. She had never known the touch of a man's hand beyond a polite greeting. The very thought of it, the intimacy she read about in her hidden books, sent a wave of heat up her neck that had nothing to do with the desert sun. She felt this lack of experience as a hollow space inside her, but also, strangely, as a shield. She was running, not from anyone, but from a life that had been laid out for her, a quiet, gray existence as a companion to a wealthy aunt. This journey was her one act of defiance. In her reticule, beneath a linen handkerchief, was the letter from her father. He had been gone 5 years, but his words were her compass. Choose your own way. Eliza, do not let them build your fences. And so she had chosen a clipped advertisement in the Christian Recorder for a teacher, a formal reply, a letter of invitation, bearing the surprisingly elegant signature of Mayor Crowley of San Miguel Wash, a town she could not find on any proper map, a place that existed only in promises. Her belongings were few, but heavy. A large trunk filled mostly with books, Shakespeare, Virgil, primers on arithmetic and grammar, and her volumes of poetry. Beside her on the seat, taking up the space of a person, was her camera. It was a heavy box of polished mahogany and brass. Old even for the times, it used glass plates and volatile chemicals. A slow and cumbersome process, but it was hers. It was, she felt, the only way she truly knew how to see the world, to capture it, to prove it was real. The railroad was coming. The other passengers, a pair of weary prospectors and a silent woman in black, spoke of it in low tones. The Atchison and Santa Fe. It was a line of iron and fire cutting through the territory. And it needed water. Everything here needed water. The talk always came back to water. The stagecoach hit a vicious rut, throwing Eliza hard against the door. The leather strap bit into her arm. "Apologies, miss," the driver called down, his voice gravelly with the dust. "This track ain't been kept. Not since Silas Wren's freight wagon started tearing it to hell." Eliza rubbed her arm, catching the name, Silas Wren. She had heard it at the last way station, a name spoken with a mixture of fear and forced respect. A man who owned the largest cattle ranch in the basin. A man who, it was whispered, had the ear of the railroad and the hand of the territorial legislature. The coach groaned, pulling itself up a long, dry incline. The world outside was vast and empty and terrifying. Eliza clutched the letter in her reticule. Choose your own way. She had chosen, now she had to survive it. Several miles south, hidden by a ridge of sandstone that resembled a sleeping lizard, Atza Nez watched the plume of dust from the stagecoach. He was 27 years old. He had been a scout for wagon trains, guiding them through passes he had known since childhood. He had seen enough of the white man's world to want no part of its hunger. He moved with a quiet economy, his moccasins making no sound on the hot rock. He carried himself with a stillness that settlers often mistook for menace, but it was just a way of being. He did not waste movement. He did not waste words. His left shoulder ached. It was an old companion. That ache, a puckered, ropey scar, a souvenir from a cavalry skirmish, tightened when the air was this dry. He had seen too much blood. He hated the waste of it. All he wanted now was a life that belonged to him, a quiet place to build, not to break. He was tired of revenge. He was not watching the stagecoach. He was gathering. His fingers moved gently over a brittle snakeweed, pinching the yellow flowers and placing them in a leather pouch. He was here for Doña Marisol. The old Mexican woman lived in a small adobe near the spring. She had been the only one to offer him aid when he'd been wounded, tending his shoulder with herbs and stern kindness. Now, he transported her remedies, gathered plants she could no longer reach, and in exchange, he had a mat by her fire and a quiet respect that felt more like home than any place he had known. Doña Marisol, and the spring El Ojo del Rio, the eye of the river. It was the heart of the basin, the only reliable water for 50 miles. The spring was the trouble. Atsa's jaw tightened. He thought of his uncle. He had come to the spring to fish, as his people had done for 1,000 years. But men were there, white men. They wore dusters and carried repeating rifles, and their horses bore the fresh brand of a W. They had not asked his uncle to leave. They had simply beaten him, breaking his arm and 2 ribs, leaving him in the shallow water as a message about the water. Silas Wren. The name was a dry sickness in Atsa's throat. A rancher. The settlers called him a contractor. The railroad men called him. He was a man who saw the land as something to be broken and sold. The coming railroad needed water for its steam engines. Wren's cattle needed water, and Silas Wren intended to provide it. He used the American law, a strange thing called prior appropriation. The first man to take the water and put it to beneficial use owned the rights. Wren had a dozen regulators on his payroll, hired guns whose job it was to ensure he was always the first, even when he arrived last. They were appropriating the spring, one beating, one burned line shack at a time. It was a slow, simmering war. The new settlers, the old Mexican families who had been here since the Spanish, and his own people, the Navajo, all watching the water, all watching Silas Wren. Atsa finished gathering the herbs. He turned to leave, his hand brushing against the sandstone. His fingers found the carving, a familiar shape in the rock. It was a handprint, small and clear, etched by an ancestor long past. It was a marker of memory. It meant the people were here. It meant the water was life, a gift for all. Silas Wren would not understand such a thing. Eliza, miles away in the jolting coach, saw it. A sudden, impossible slash of green against the red rock, a line of cottonwoods and willow. It vanished as the coach dipped into an arroyo, but the image stayed with her. Water, life. She felt a strange, sudden certainty. Her destination was there. She placed a protective hand on the wooden box beside her. The lens, the glass plate. She would see this place. She would capture the truth of it. Atsa slung the pouch over his good shoulder. The ache in his left was sharp now. He tasted the dust. It smelled of iron and greed. He wanted peace, but peace was a luxury this land could no longer afford. The breaking, he feared, was coming soon. The lurch was so violent it snapped her head back. A sound, not a rut, but a sharp, metallic crack, was followed by the scream of splintering wood. The driver's oath was cut short by a heavier, sickening thud. The world tilted. Eliza was thrown from her seat, her head striking the roof as the stagecoach careened. The woman in black screamed, a high, thin sound. Then came the final, shuddering crash as the vehicle overturned, dragging on its side for several yards before grinding to a halt in a cloud of choking red dust. Silence, thick and absolute, followed. Eliza gasped, her lungs full of powder. Pain, sharp and bright, lanced up her left arm. She was wedged beneath the prospector, who was groaning, and the silent woman, who was now unnervingly still. "Get off!" she choked, pushing. The man grunted and shifted. Eliza scrambled, clawing her way toward the light that filtered through the ruined door. She pulled herself free and tumbled onto the hot, rocky ground of the pass. Dead Man's Cut. The name echoed in her head. The scene was devastation. One horse was down, its leg at an impossible angle. The driver was lying 20 feet away, unmoving. The lead horse was struggling in its harness, kicking wildly. And there was a smell. Beneath the dust and the sweat, there was a scent of hot, scorched iron. She saw them then. Small, wicked-looking iron jacks, scattered across the narrowest part of the pass. Caltrops. This was not an accident. This was an ambush. A shadow moved on the ridge above them. A flicker of motion. Eliza froze. Her heart, which had been pounding with panic, now seized with a different, colder fear. Someone was watching. She instinctively grabbed for her camera. It had been thrown clear, its mahogany box scarred but intact. She fumbled with the clasp, her left wrist sending a bolt of agony up her arm. She ignored it. She pulled the heavy box close, her body shielding it. Another shadow moved, this one much closer. A man, stepping from the cover of the boulders. He was tall, dressed not in settler's clothes, but in tanned buckskins and a loose cotton shirt. His black hair was tied back, and his face was stark, defined by high cheekbones and a stillness that was more terrifying than any war cry. He was an Indian, a Navajo, she guessed, from the pictures she had seen. Everything she had ever been told, every story of captivity and scalping, rose in her throat like bile. She scrambled backward, dragging the camera with her, stopping when her back hit the hot metal of the wrecked coach. He did not approach. He stopped a good 30 feet away. He looked at the wreckage. He looked at the driver. He looked at the man groaning inside the coach. Then his eyes settled on her. He said nothing. He simply held up one hand, palm out, a sign of peace, perhaps, or a command to stop. He moved then, but not toward her. He walked to the struggling horse, his movements fluid and economical. He spoke to it in a low, soft voice, a language she could not understand. The horse's panicked kicking subsided, its eyes rolling. He calmly took a knife from his belt and, with a few quick, decisive motions, cut the harness, freeing the animal. It scrambled to its feet and bolted down the pass. He turned back to the wreckage. He still kept his distance from Eliza. He peered inside, then looked at the driver. He knelt by the driver for a long moment, then stood and shook his head once. He walked toward her. Eliza pressed herself flat against the wreckage. Her breath came in shallow, painful gasps. Her wrist throbbed, a sick, heavy pulse. He stopped 10 feet from her. He did not look at her face, but at her arm, which she was clutching to her chest. "Your arm is broken," he said. His voice was quiet, a low resonance with almost no accent. She stared, unable to speak. "I will not harm you," he said. He gestured to the ridge above. "Others will. We must leave." "The others," Eliza whispered, nodding toward the coach. "The man inside lives. The woman, she is gone. The driver is gone. He said it not with cruelty, but as a statement of fact. Who are you?" "My name is Atsanez." He looked up at the ridge again. The sun glinted off something metal up there. A rifle barrel. "They are waiting to see who survived." Eliza's mind was slow, foggy with pain and fear. "The men who did this," he pointed with his chin at the caltrops. "Wren's men." The name, Silas Wren. Atsa stepped forward. Slowly. "I must look at your arm. I will not touch you otherwise. Do I have your permission?" Permission. The word was so startling, so civilized. It broke through her panic. She looked at his face, really looked at him. His eyes were dark, but not unkind. They were assessing, intelligent. He was nothing like the wild savages of the Penny Dreadfuls. He was just a man, a very calm man in a very terrible situation. She swallowed the dust and nodded, a tiny, jerky motion. He knelt, his movements precise. He was careful not to crowd her. "Show me." She held out her left arm. Her wrist was already swelling. a grotesque purple bruising spreading under the skin. He barely touched her, his fingers light, probing the bones with a practiced efficiency. She winced, biting her lip. "It is not a bad break," he said, "but it must be set." He stood and walked to a shattered piece of the coach's frame. He selected 2 flat splinters of wood, smoothing the edges with his knife. He returned, and from his pouch, he took a long, thin strip of cured leather. "This will hurt," he said, his voice still quiet. Before she could tense, he took her wrist in one hand and her elbow in the other. He pulled. It was a sharp, steady traction. Eliza cried out, a muffled sound, as the bone slid into place. The bright, sharp pain subsided, replaced by a deep, throbbing ache. He worked quickly, laying the wood splints on either side of her forearm and binding them with a leather thong, his knots firm and clean. He did it all with an impersonal focus, his eyes on the task, not on her. He kept his body angled away, giving her space, never looming. It was the most profound courtesy she had ever been shown. "Can you walk?" he asked, standing back up. I think so." She tried to push herself up, but her good hand slipped, and she nearly fell. He did not reach for her. He waited. "You must—" She tried again, planting her feet and using the wrecked coach for leverage. She swayed, but she stood. The world spun for a moment. "My camera," she said, her voice sounding thin. He looked at the heavy box. He nodded. "I will carry it." He slung its strap over his good shoulder, opposite the one that seemed to stiffen as he moved. "We go this way," he pointed. "Not down the pass, but up, toward a narrow cleft in the rock, Arroyo del Cuervo. It is hidden." "What about the prospector, the man inside?" "He is alive, but he cannot be moved. They will find him." "Find him? The men on the ridge?" "Yes." "They will kill him," she whispered, horrified. "No," Atsa said. "He is not what they wanted. He is a message. You are what they wanted. Me, the idea was absurd. They do not know me. They know a schoolteacher was coming on this coach. They do not want a schoolteacher here. They do not want witnesses." A new shadow moved on the ridge. A man, silhouetted against the bright sky. He was walking down, moving toward the wreckage. He was retrieving the caltrops. It was an instinct. Eliza grabbed the camera from Atsa's shoulder. It was a clumsy, fumbling motion with her one good hand. She had 2 plates left, prepared that morning at the station. She steadied the box on her hip, aimed the brass lens at the distant figure, and released the shutter. A heavy click. Atsa looked at her, his expression unreadable. "What did you do?" "I took his picture," she breathed, her heart hammering. "Quickly!" he said, his voice urgent now. He took the camera back. He saw the flash. He half pushed her toward the cleft in the rocks. "Do not look back." Eliza stumbled after him, her mind a whirl. She was dependent on this man, this stranger, this Indian. She, who had come west for independence, was now utterly helpless. She hated the feeling. She hated her weakness. And beneath the hate, beneath the fear, another, more confusing feeling bloomed, a strange, unwelcome flutter in her chest as she watched the strong line of his back, the way he moved with such confidence, the way he had treated her with a respect she had never received from a man in Boston. They walked for what felt like hours. The arroyo was a winding, dry riverbed, its walls shielding them from view. Atsa moved relentlessly, setting a pace she could barely match. When the sun was low and staining the clouds a bruised purple, they emerged into a small, sheltered basin. A thread of green marked a tiny spring. Beside it, tucked against the rock, was a small adobe house, a wisp of smoke rising from its chimney. An old woman, her face a map of wrinkles, stood in the doorway. She was wiping her hands on an apron. She looked at Atsa, then at Eliza, her black eyes missing nothing. "Ah," the woman said, her voice like dry leaves. "So, it has begun." Atsa spoke to her in Spanish. too rapid for Eliza to follow. The old woman, Doña Marisol, nodded grimly. She beckoned Eliza inside. The single room was clean and smelled of herbs and wood smoke. Doña Marisol examined Eliza's wrist, clucking her tongue at the splint. "He has a good hand. This one," she said in clear, accented English. "Sit. You are safe here." She gave Eliza a cup of water. It was cool and tasted of minerals. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. Where am I?" Eliza asked, her voice trembling. "My home," Doña Marisol said. "Atza brings you here because the main road to San Miguel Wash is watched. You will stay tonight." "The men, the ambush." "See, Silas Wren," the old woman spat the name. "He is squeezing the town. He wants El Ojo del Rio, the big spring. He is pressing the town council, pushing new laws, claiming all the water rights for his cattle and the railroad." "But what does that have to do with me? With a school?" Doña Marisol smiled, a sad, knowing expression. "The school, mija, is a lie. A little sugar to make the poison go down. Mayor Crowley promises the settlers a school, a future for their children, to keep them quiet while he signs their water away to Wren. A new school teacher, arriving now. It makes the lie look real." Eliza felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. The letter from the mayor. The invitation. "Was it a trap?" she whispered. "Was I lured here?" "They did not want you to arrive," Doña Marisol said simply. "A dead teacher is a tragedy, a delay, an excuse. A teacher who starts asking questions is a problem. They hoped you would be the tragedy." Eliza looked at her bandaged arm, at the dust caked on her ruined dress. She had come west to be free, and she had walked directly into a war. Atza entered, carrying the camera. He placed it gently on the table. He looked at Eliza. "You are safe tonight," he said. "When you are stronger, I will take you to San Miguel Wash, the long way, avoiding Silas's lookouts." Eliza met his gaze. The fear was still there, but it was no longer of him. It was of this place, of Silas Wren, of the lie that had brought her here. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling small and inadequate. He gave a slight nod, accepting her thanks but not inviting conversation. He turned and went back outside, taking up a position on the bench by the door, a silent guardian watching the pass as the desert stars emerged, sharp and cold, one by one. 2 days passed in the sheltered quiet of Doña Marisol's adobe. The old woman tended Eliza's arm with a poultice of crushed leaves that smelled of dust and pine, resetting the splint with a practiced hand. Eliza's pain subsided to a dull, persistent throb. Atza was a silent presence, disappearing for hours to hunt or scout, returning with a rabbit for the pot or fresh herbs for Marisol. He rarely spoke to Eliza, but she felt his eyes on her, watchful and assessing. On the morning of the 3rd day, he deemed it safe. "We go now," he said. He led her not back to the main road, but north, through a maze of shallow canyons and washes that all looked the same to her. He moved with a speed and silence that she, in her heavy skirts and with her arm in a sling, could not match. Yet, he never got too far ahead. He set a pace for her, stopping to let her drink from his canteen, his gaze sweeping the ridges above them. San Miguel Wash was not a town. It was a scar. It lay in a dusty bowl, a single-fin wide street flanked by a dozen flat-roofed adobe buildings. Their brown walls blended into the brown earth so completely that the place seemed to be sinking back into the desert. There was a blacksmith's forge, its rhythmic hammer fall the only sign of industry, a small, whitewashed church with a crooked wooden cross, and a 2-story building with a false front. Its sign faded but legible, the Copper Lily Saloon. The air was heavy with more than dust. It was thick with suspicion. As they walked down the street, people stopped. A woman hanging laundry froze, her hands still on the line. 2 men sitting on a porch fell silent, their eyes tracking Atza. It was a tangible, hostile quiet. They were not looking at her. The injured newcomer, They were looking at the Navajo man guiding her. Atsa ignored them. He led her past the saloon, past the sheriff's office, directly to the small church. A woman in a simple gray habit was vigorously sweeping the front step, raising a cloud of red dust. She looked up as they approached, and her face, weathered by the sun but possessed of a deep kindness, broke into a small smile. "Well," she said, her voice warm and practical, "you must be Miss Hart. It seems you found trouble before you found the town." "Sister Agnes?" Atsa said. It was a greeting and an explanation in one. "Bring her inside," the nun said, holding the door, "out of this heat." The chapel was cool and dark, smelling of beeswax and old wood. Sister Agnes was, as Doña Marisol had said, the town's nurse. She clucked over Eliza's arm, examining Atsa's handiwork. "He ties a good splint," she remarked, looking at Atsa with open respect. "Better than our doctor, when he bothers to show up. You were lucky he found you." "It was not luck, sister," Eliza said, her voice quiet. "The stage was wrecked, deliberately." Sister Agnes's smile faded. She met Atsa's eyes, and a silent, grim understanding passed between them. "Then you were more than lucky. You were preserved. Sit. I will fetch you clean water and a room." As Sister Agnes bustled away, the door opened again, casting a long rectangle of light onto the floor. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. He wore a tin star, but it was dull, as if it had not been polished in months. "Nez," the man said, his voice weary. He stepped inside, revealing a haggard face and tired eyes. "You causing trouble? Or bringing it?" "Sheriff Doolin," Atsa replied, his tone flat. "I brought the new school teacher. What was left of her stage?" Sheriff Doolin looked at Eliza, his gaze lingering on her splint. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his thinning hair. "We heard a terrible accident." "It was no accident, Sheriff," Eliza said firmly. Doolin sighed, a long, rattling breath. He seemed to shrink. "Miss Hart, this is a hard place. Things happen. Accidents." He clearly did not want to hear any more. Before Eliza could protest, the sound of the blacksmith's hammer stopped. A moment later, a man filled the doorway. He was broad-shouldered, his bare arms corded with muscle, his face slick with sweat and soot. He grinned when he saw Atsa. "Hermano," he boomed, clasping Atsa's good shoulder. "You have been too long away." He looked at Eliza and Sister Agnes, and his grin softened. "Forgive me, Sister, Miss Hart, I am Miguel Ortega." "Miguel," Atsa said, and the two men stepped outside, speaking in low, rapid voices, a mix of Spanish and English. "Do not mind the sheriff," Sister Agnes said, returning with a tin cup of water. "He is a man caught between his badge and his wages. They are not always paid by the same source." A new figure approached the church. This man was different. Where Doolin was worn and Miguel was soot-stained, this man was clean. He wore a dark suit, a white shirt, and a string tie. His graying hair was neatly combed, and he smiled a wide, welcoming smile. "Miss Hart," he exclaimed, rushing forward, "a miracle. We heard the stage was lost. I am Mayor Crowley. Welcome. Welcome to San Miguel Wash." His handshake was dry and firm, but his eyes, Eliza noticed, were as cold and flat as gray stone. "We have been so looking forward to your arrival. A school is the mark of a true civilization." "My stage was wrecked, Mayor," Eliza said, pulling her hand back, "by men." Crowley's smile did not falter. "Yes, a terrible tragedy. The territory is rife with bandits. But you are safe now. Safe with us." He gestured broadly. "In fact, you have arrived at a perfect time. We are holding a town meeting this very afternoon, at the Copper Lily. A momentous day. You must come. Let the town see their new teacher is here, safe and sound." The Copper Lily Saloon was not built for a town meeting. It was hot, crowded, and smelled of stale whiskey and anxious sweat. Eliza sat in the back with Sister Agnes and Miguel. Atza did not enter. He stood outside, across the street, leaning against the forge wall, watching. The meeting was run by one man. Silas Wren stood at the front of the room, flanked by 4 men in long dusters. He was not what Eliza had expected. He was tall, handsome in a severe way, and dressed in the fine suit of a businessman. He spoke with a smooth, educated voice that commanded attention. "Friends, neighbors," he began. "We stand on the precipice of greatness. The Atchison and Santa Fe Railroad is our future. It brings trade, it brings growth, it brings civilization to this valley." He paused, letting his words sink in. But progress requires fuel. And in this land, the fuel is water. The railroad needs a reliable source to power its engines. My proposal is simple: a temporary dam, a small diversion of El Ojo del Rio, just to see the construction through. A murmur went through the crowd. A few settlers nodded, but the older Mexican families and the small ranchers looked at the floor. "It is for the good of all," Wren said, his voice rising. "The spring belongs to everyone," Miguel Ortega called out from the back. Wren's eyes snapped to him. "Mr. Ortega, your forge uses very little water. My cattle and the railroad need much more. We are building a future, not hammering horseshoes." Then, his gaze swept the room and landed on Eliza. His expression softened, becoming a mask of warm solicitation. "And we are so blessed to have a new face of that future with us today," he said, smiling directly at her. "Miss Eliza Hart. She has survived a terrible ordeal to be here, to educate our children." Eliza felt the heat rise in her face as every eye in the room turned to her. "To welcome you, Miss Hart," Silas continued. "I am personally pledging the funds to build the new schoolhouse, timber, glass, and fresh-cut desks. We must invest in what matters." The settlers applauded. Eliza felt sick. She looked away from Wren's predatory charm and at the men behind him. Her breath caught in her throat. One of them, a man with a long scar down his right cheek, was watching her. He was not smiling. He was the man from the ridge, the man she had photographed through her lens, the man who had been retrieving the caltrops from the wreckage of her stagecoach. She stared at him, and he, realizing he was recognized, slowly looked away, his expression unchanged. Silas Wren was welcoming her. His man had tried to kill her. "Mayor Crowley has the agreement," Wren said, turning the meeting back to business. Crowley stepped forward, holding a stack of papers. "Just a formality. Friends, a simple contract allowing Mr. Wren to manage the water diversion." Miguel took one of the papers and squinted at the dense blocks of text. "This is written by a lawyer, not a neighbor." "Allow me," Eliza said, her voice surprisingly clear. She stepped forward and took the paper. Her good hand trembled, but not from fear. It was rage. She scanned the document. She had read enough contracts with her father. It was all there, buried in legal language. The key phrase was in a very small script, granting temporary and exclusive diversion rights. Said rights to be reviewed upon completion of the rail line. "Mayor," Eliza said, her voice cutting through the stuffy air, "this contract does not specify an end date for this temporary diversion. It gives Mr. Wren permanent control of the spring." Silence. Silas Wren's smile tightened. Mayor Crowley flushed. Before anyone could speak, Sheriff Doolin stepped forward. "Now, miss, that is a matter for the lawyers. I think the meeting is done." The meeting dissolved, the settlers moving out, whispering. Eliza felt trapped. She walked outside into the blinding sunlight, her mind reeling. Sheriff Doolin caught her arm. He leaned in, his voice a low, desperate whisper. "Miss Hart, I am telling you as a friend. You should not have done that. You should not be here." "I am leaving. Sheriff, as soon as I can." "You do not understand." He gestured to the mouth of the pass. "The only way out of the valley?" 2 men on horseback were visible. Small dots in the distance. Ren's regulators. They are guarding the pass, protecting his freight. He says, no one gets in or out without his say, leaving this town right now. It would be unwise, very unwise. The trap snapped shut. She was a prisoner. She walked back to the church, her head down. She felt Atsa's eyes on her, but she did not look up. She went to the small room Sister Agnes had given her. The camera box was on the floor. She sat and looked at it. She was not a victim. She was not a prisoner. She was a witness. They had tried to kill her to stop her from arriving. They had offered her a school to buy her silence. They had trapped her in this valley. She thought of her father's letter. Choose your own way. Running was not a choice. Her motive was no longer just survival. It was not even about the school anymore. It was about the water. It was about the truth. That camera was her weapon. She was startled by a shout. A boy was running down the street, yelling, "Fire, fire," at Dona Marisol's. Eliza's heart stopped. She ran out of the church. Atsa was already moving, his long strides eating up the ground. Miguel right behind him. When they reached the small adobe, it was not the house that was burning. It was the shed beside it. The small, carefully built shed where Doña Marisol dried her herbs and kept her medicines. It was not a wild blaze. It was a thick, choking, smoldering fire. The smoke was acrid, smelling of burning sage and ruined herbs. Someone had barred the door and set it to burn slowly, destroying everything inside. A winter's worth of healing. Gone. Doña Marisol stood watching, her hands clenched at her sides. She did not cry. Her face was a mask of cold fury. This was the answer to Eliza's accusation at the meeting. This was the warning. Atsa stood beside the old woman, his body rigid. He looked at the smoking ruin. This was his home. This was his Kay, his family. He had wanted no war. He hated the waste of blood. But this was a different kind of violence. This was an attack on life itself. The spring was his mother's memory. It was the valley's heart, and Silas Wren was poisoning it. Eliza came to stand with them. The three of them, the teacher, the healer, the blacksmith. She looked at the smoke, then at Atsa. Her fear was gone, burned away by a cold, clear anger. I have it, she said, her voice low. Atsa turned to her. The photograph of the man who set the caltrops, the man with the scar. He works for Wren. I have his picture. Atsa looked from the smoking shed to her face. He saw no fear. He saw a resolve that matched his own. One photograph, he said, his voice flat, is not enough proof. Then we will get more, Eliza said, her good hand clenched into a fist. We will get proof of all of it. The ambush, the men he hired, the plan to steal the spring. We will use my camera. We will use your eyes. We will find witnesses. We will stop him. Atsa looked at the ruin, then at Doña Marisol, and finally back at Eliza. He gave a single, sharp nod. The decision was made. They left before the moon had set, two figures moving not toward the road, but into the broken, rocky land north of the town. A rare, fleeting rain had passed in the deepest part of the night, not enough to soak the earth, but just enough to settle the dust and sharpen the air with the scent of creosote. Atsa carried a rifle, his canteen, and a small pouch. Eliza, her arm bound tightly in its sling, carried the heavy mahogany camera box, its strap digging into her good shoulder. Miguel had argued to come, but Atsa had refused. We need you in the town, Atsa had said, his voice low. If we are not back by midday, or if you hear 3 shots, you will know. But at noon, no matter what, I need you to make noise, a signal, something loud, from the forge. Miguel had gripped his friend's shoulder. Be careful. Hermano, Wren's men are not fools. Neither are we, Atsa had replied. He led Eliza on a path that was not a path, a route known only to him, following dry washes and the contours of the land. He moved with a relentless, silent grace. Eliza struggled. The heavy skirts she had insisted on wearing, a dark wool concession to propriety, snagged on thorns. The camera box was awkward and heavy, but she did not complain. She bit her lip and kept moving, her breath rasping in the cool morning air. "Where are we going?" she whispered, after an hour of hard walking. "Ren is smart," Atsa said, not looking back. "He will not dam the Ojo, the spring, where the town can see. He will go upstream, to the source, the little Colorado. He will cut the head from the snake." They followed a newly dug ditch, a raw, straight scar across the landscape, wide enough for a wagon. It was crude, but effective. Designed to catch and divert water, it led them for miles, climbing steadily toward the dark line of mesas that marked the river. By mid-morning, they reached the banks. The little Colorado was running higher than Eliza had seen it, a churning cold red from the night's rain. The ditch ended here, at a wide, cleared flat. "You stay here," Atsa commanded, pointing to a cluster of tamarisks and willow that offered cover. "Watch the ridge. I will go down to the water, see what they have built." Eliza nodded, sinking gratefully to the ground. She slid the camera box from her aching shoulder and positioned herself, her gaze scanning the high rock walls of the canyon. The silence was immense, broken only by the rushing sound of the river below. She watched the ridge for a long time. Her eyes grew tired. Her gaze drifted, pulled by the sound of the water, down to the riverbank. She saw him. He was standing in the river, the water swirling fast and cold around his waist. He had taken off his cotton shirt, and his back was to her. The sun, finally breaking through the high, thin clouds, illuminated his skin. It was a dark copper, and she could see the muscles in his back and shoulders move as he washed the dust and sweat from his face and neck. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She saw the scar, the one she had heard about, a pale, puckered mark on his left shoulder. He turned, sluicing water over his chest, and she saw him fully. She had never, in her entire 20 years, seen a man not like this, not unguarded, unadorned, unbound by the stiff collars and woolen suits of Boston. He was stark and real, like the landscape around them. A profound, shocking heat flooded her body, starting low in her belly and rising to scorch her face. Her heart began a heavy, frantic beat. It was not fear. It was not panic. It was a terrifying, bewildering awareness. She knew, in that instant, that she was no longer the girl who had stepped off the stagecoach. She should look away. Every rule of conduct, every lesson of her upbringing, demanded she turn her head. She was a lady. He was a savage, but her eyes refused to obey. He was not a savage. He was a man. He looked up, and he saw her. He froze. Eliza froze. Mortification washed over her, colder than the river water. She was caught. She had been spying. He did not move to cover himself. He did not shout or show anger. He simply stood, the water pressing against him, and held her gaze. He saw the panic in her eyes, but he also saw the deep flush on her skin, the tremor in her good hand. He understood. He broke the moment, not with accusation, but with a simple human gesture. He lifted his hand, palm open. He did not point at her, but to the bank beside her, where his shirt and a small linen cloth lay on a rock. He was asking for the cloth. Then, his eyes still on hers, he made a second, slight gesture, a small incline of his head, a movement of his open hand, inviting her closer. "May I approach?" The question was silent, but unmistakable. He was not assuming. He was not demanding. He was asking permission. He was giving her the choice. The knot of fear and confusion in Eliza's chest dissolved. Her heart still raced, but the terror was gone, replaced by something warm and shaky. With her one good hand, she reached down and picked up the dry linen. She stood, her legs unsteady, and walked to the edge of the high bank. She kept her eyes on his face, not on his body. He moved through the water, the current strong against his legs, until he stood directly below her. He stopped, still in the river. water dripping from his black hair. His hands reached out. Eliza knelt and held out the cloth. He took it. His fingers brushed hers. The brief touch was electric, a jolt that seemed to stop her breath. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. "You are welcome," she whispered. She could not hold his gaze. She turned and walked quickly back to her post, her entire body trembling. He joined her a few minutes later, his shirt damp and clinging to his shoulders, his hair slicked back. The intense, personal moment was gone, replaced by the grim focus of their mission. "This way," he said, his voice all business. They found the work site 50 yards downstream, hidden by a bend in the river. Wren's men had been busy. Newly sharpened wooden stakes, driven deep into the bank, marked a straight, unnatural line. "Surveyor's stakes," Eliza breathed, her hand going to her camera. Atza nodded. He moved ahead, his eyes scanning the rocks. He found the cache, tucked beneath a wide, flat ledge of sandstone. A canvas sack lay half-hidden, dark with damp from the night's rain. He pulled it out. Eliza saw the markings stenciled on the side property of the ANSFRR. Atza untied the top. It was full of sticks of dynamite and coils of fuse. "He is using the railroad's explosives," Eliza said, her voice a shocked whisper. "He means to blast the river." "To turn it," Atza confirmed, his face hard. "To send the water into his new ditch. The Ojo will be dry in a month." "Help me," Eliza said. She scrambled to set up the heavy camera on a flat rock, her mind racing. Her left arm was a clumsy, painful hindrance, but she worked through it, her teeth gritted. She took the picture, the stakes, the line they made. She changed the glass plate, a slow, fumbling process with one hand. She aimed the lens at the canvas bag, making sure the railroad markings were sharp and clear. While she worked, Atza searched. He found something else, caught in the reeds near the bank. It was a piece of driftwood, and it had been carved. It was a crude map, sketched in charcoal, showing the river, the new ditch, and the Ojo. At the bottom, someone had burned a mark into the wood, a perfect, clear horseshoe. In the center was the letter W. "Atza," she breathed, pointing. He brought it to her. She steadied her hands, her excitement overcoming her pain. She took the third picture. They sat for a moment in the silence, the evidence captured on glass. "Why do you do this?" Eliza asked, her voice low. "This is not your fight. You are Navajo. This is a settler's town." Atza looked at the churning red water. "My mother brought me to the Ojo when I was a boy. She taught me the herbs that grow on its bank. The water is for Dine. The people, it is for the Mexican families. It is for the land itself. One man cannot own it." He turned to look at her, his dark eyes intense. "I was a scout, a warrior, for the wagons, for the soldiers. I have seen enough blood. I want to be a healer, to build something. Wren, he only knows how to break. Someone must stop the breaking." Eliza felt a strange, powerful kinship with him. He had put into words the feelings she had not been able to name. "My father left me a letter," she said, her good hand instinctively touching the pocket of her dress. "He told me to choose my own way. I thought I was choosing a quiet life, a school. But this is the way. I cannot turn back." She looked at him, and the words tumbled out before she could stop them. Born of the intimacy of the river and the tension of the moment, "Atza, I am grateful for your help, but I feel—" She stopped, her face flushing again. "I do not know what I feel." He did not look away. He held her gaze, his expression serious. "Eliza, you are a woman alone in a hard place. You are injured. I am helping you. That is all it needs to be." "It is not all," she whispered, the honesty of it raw in the air. He let out a slow breath. "No, it is not all. I feel it also. But this is a dangerous time. You are not familiar with men." With this. I am not a child, she said, a spark of her old anger returning. I did not say you were. His voice was gentle, but firm. I am saying I will not rush you. I will not push you. This path is hard enough. We will walk it. We will go as slow as you need. It was a promise of safety, a promise of choice. It was more intimate than any touch she had ever imagined. A sound shattered the stillness, a horse's nicker, sharp and close. In one fluid motion, Atsa was on his feet, pulling her down behind a dense wall of tamarisk and reeds. He put one hand on her shoulder, pressing her low to the damp earth. "Do not move," he breathed into her ear. "Do not make a sound." 3 riders came into view on the opposite bank, exactly where Eliza and Atsa had been. They wore long dusters, and their rifles were in their scabbards. One of them, Eliza saw with a jolt of cold fear, was the man with the scar. "He said he'd meet us here," the scarred man growled, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "Check the cache," another man said. One of them dismounted and scrambled down the bank. He walked directly to the rock ledge. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. Had she left the bag as they had found it? "It's here," the man shouted. "Still dry enough." The scarred man spat into the river. "Good. You ride back. Tell Silas it is all set. We do the blast on Friday night, after the whole town is asleep. This rain is perfect. The flood will look like nature. By morning, the river will be running in his ditch. The Oho will be dry in a week." Friday night, they had 2 days. The men stood for a moment, scanning the opposite bank. Eliza held her breath, convinced they could hear her heart. A mosquito whined near her ear, but she dared not move. Atsa was as still as the stone beside him, only his eyes moving, tracking the men. Then a new sound began, faint but clear. Clang, clang, clang! It was the sound of a hammer on an anvil, echoing down the canyon. It was coming from San Miguel Wash, miles away. The men on the bank heard it. "What in the hell?" one of them said, looking south. "It's just Ortega," the scarred man said, annoyed, "at his forge." "Sounds wrong," the first man said. "It's not a rhythm, just banging." Clang, clang, clang! It was Miguel. It was noon. It was the signal. The scarred man hesitated, listening. Something is wrong. Maybe trouble back at the saloon. "Mount up. We are done here." The 3 men spurred their horses, climbing the bank and disappearing over the ridge. Eliza and Atsa stayed hidden, not moving, for a long, agonizing 10 minutes. Finally, Atsa let out his breath in a long sigh. "Miguel," he said. He kept his word. "Friday night," Eliza said, her voice shaking as she got to her feet. "They are going to blow up the river on Friday night." "Then we have 2 days," Atsa said. He retrieved the camera box, his face grim. "We have the proof. Now we have to find a way to use it." They returned to San Miguel Wash under the cover of dusk. Separating before they reached the main street, Atsa faded into the shadows near the livery, while Eliza, carrying the heavy, precious box, went straight to the church. The small room behind the chapel became a command center. Miguel was there, his face grim, having waited hours for their return. Sister Agnes was lighting a second lantern, her lips moving in a silent prayer. Doña Marisol sat by the small window, her hands folded, watching the street. "Friday night," Eliza announced. Placing the camera on the table, the words fell like stones into the quiet room. "He plans to blast the river on Friday night." Miguel cursed, a low, sharp word in Spanish. 2 days. We have 2 days. "We have proof," Eliza said. She looked at the camera. "But it is useless inside this box. I must develop the plates. Tonight." This presented a new, formidable challenge. Developing glass plates required absolute, perfect darkness, and a careful hand with volatile chemicals. "The cellar," Sister Agnes said instantly. "Beneath the chapel, it is dry and has no windows. Miguel, Fetch blankets. We must seal the door." "I will need water. Clean water," Eliza said, her mind racing, ticking through the steps. Her kit was in her trunk, and my chemical box. "Atza will fetch your trunk," Doña Marisol said, as if it were already decided. He appeared in the doorway as she spoke, silent as the shadows he moved through. He had already heard. He looked at Eliza and nodded once, then vanished again. The next hour was a tense, hurried preparation. Miguel and Atza returned, carrying Eliza's heavy trunk, while Miguel and Sister Agnes sealed the cellar door, blocking every crack of light with heavy blankets. Eliza unpacked her kit with her one good hand. The small, corked bottles of collodion, silver nitrate, and pyrogallic acid felt strange in her grip. "This is dangerous," she warned them, laying the bottles out. "The developer! It is poison. And the fumes. I must be alone." "I will guard the door," Atza said. His voice was final. "And I," Miguel added, standing beside him. Eliza descended the steep wooden steps into the blackness. Sister Agnes handed her the box of plates, a bucket of water, and a single, shielded dark room lantern. The heavy trapdoor closed above her, plunging her into a thick, subterranean darkness. She lit the lantern. Its ruby-red glow cast strange, demonic shadows on the earthen walls. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and mice. Her left arm, trapped in its sling, was a useless, throbbing weight. She would have to do this all with her right hand. She set up her trays. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the immense, crushing weight of the task. If she failed, if she spilled the silver bath, if she let a single stray shard of light touch the plates, their proof was gone. Above, she could hear the faint, muffled footsteps of Atza pacing by the door. She took a breath and began. She poured the chemicals. The sharp, metallic scent of the developer filled the small space. She slid the first glass plate from its holder and submerged it. She waited. It was an agony of stillness. She counted. 1 minute, 2. She lifted the plate, her fingers dripping. She held it to the red light. An image, faint as a ghost, emerged from the dark glass. A line of stakes, the churn of the river. It was blurry. The light had been poor, but it was there. It was undeniable. She worked faster, her confidence growing. The second plate, the canvas sack. She held it up. The stenciled letters, A and SFR, were clear. A gasp of triumph escaped her. The third plate, the driftwood map. She dipped it, her hand shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She steadied herself against the wall. She lifted it. The crude lines of the map, and at the bottom, the burned-in horseshoe, the W. She had it all. When she emerged an hour later, blinking in the yellow lamplight of the chapel, she was pale and sweating, but victorious. The 4 of them, the alliance of the healer, the blacksmith, the nun, and the teacher, huddled around the table. "It is enough," Miguel said, his voice thick with awe. He marked his own crime. "Proof is one thing," Sister Agnes said, her brow furrowed. "Using it is another. Sheriff Doolin is a weak reed." "We must force him," Eliza insisted. "Not just force him," the nun replied, a new hard light in her eye. "We must guide him. I have been reading, not just my Bible." She produced a thin, worn book, the territorial statutes. I found a clause, sent from Washington. It is a federal law. It is a crime, punishable by imprisonment, to willfully impede or destroy a public waterway for private gain. This is not a town matter. Eliza, this is a federal crime. The plan formed quickly. They would present the evidence and the law to Doolin at the same time. They found him, as Sister Agnes had predicted, in his office, asleep with his boots on his desk. He awoke with a guilty start, his hand flying to his gun. "What is it?" he snapped, seeing the 4 of them file into his small, cluttered office. "Sheriff," Sister Agnes said, acting as the spokesperson. We are here to file a criminal complaint. A complaint against who Doolin blustered, though his eyes were wary. Against Silas Wren, Eliza said, stepping forward. She laid the 3 wet glass plates on his desk. For the planned destruction of the Little Colorado River, for the theft of railroad property, and for the attempted murder of the passengers on the stagecoach from Santa Fe. Doolin stared at the photographs, his face draining of color. I cannot. You can, Sister Agnes said, tapping the open book. Federal Statute. Title 4, Section 6, Impeding a Public Waterway. You are bound by your oath, Sheriff, to uphold it, or we will be forced to send word to the U.S. Marshal in Prescott that you refused. The sheriff was trapped. He looked from the damning photographs to the federal law. He was a man drowning in a situation far deeper than he had ever intended. He slumped in his chair. The picture of defeat. All right, he whispered. I will file the complaint. I will lock these pictures in my safe. I will look into it. You will do more than look, Sheriff, Miguel said, his voice a low growl. You will stop him. You cannot expect me to arrest Silas Wren, Doolin cried. Panicked. His men. They would burn this town to the ground. We expect you to stop that dynamite, Eliza said. Friday night. Doolin said nothing. He just took the plates in the book and locked them in his iron safe. The meeting was over. It was a victory, but it felt thin and fragile. The next day, the town was buzzing. News of the late-night visit to the sheriff had spread. Silas Wren was not a man to be challenged. Eliza was walking from the church to the forge when Wren found her. He stepped out of the copper lily, his broad shoulders blocking the sun. He was dressed impeccably, and his smile was wide and blindingly charming. Miss Hart, he said, his voice like warm honey. He ignored the tension of the past few days. You look troubled. This town. It is a heavy burden, is it not? Eliza said nothing, her good hand clenching. What these people need is a reminder of civilization, of joy. He swept his hat from his head. I am hosting a dance, this very evening, at the Lily, a celebration of the railroad, of our new school. He paused, his eyes locking onto hers. I would be deeply honored if you would attend as my guest. It was a trap, laid in plain sight. He was doing it publicly. 2 settlers and their wives, passing by, stopped to smile. They saw the wealthy rancher, the town's benefactor, and the pretty new teacher. A perfect match. To refuse here would be a public insult. To accept would be a public surrender. She would become, as she had feared, the face of his project, the sugar for his poison. Mr. Wren, she said, her voice tight. Given the circumstances, I do not think. I insist, he said, his smile never wavering, though his eyes were hard. It is for the town, to show them we are united. I will save the first waltz for you. He bowed, placed his hat back on his head, and walked away, leaving her standing in the dust. She felt a twist of panic, but it was quickly overshadowed by a different, sharper emotion. She had gone to the forge to find Atza and Miguel. They were standing near the quenching trough, talking in low, urgent tones. As she approached, a young woman, hardly more than a girl, hurried out of the mercantile. She was lovely, with bright eyes and hair as black as a raven's wing. She ran directly to Atza, a bright smile on her face. Atza, she said, her voice musical. She spoke in rapid Spanish, and then held up a small, woven bracelet of red and black thread. Para la suerte, for luck. Before he could react, she grabbed his hand and quickly tied the bracelet onto his wrist. She touched his arm, her fingers lingering, then laughed and ran back to her father's shop. Atza stood for a moment, looking at the bracelet, his expression unreadable. Eliza stopped. A hot, ugly feeling coiled in her gut. It was a physical pain, a sickness. It was jealousy. She had no right to it. He was not hers. She had no claim on him. But the sight of that girl's hand on his arm, of that colorful band on his wrist, felt like a betrayal. She hated the feeling, hated herself for her small, possessive heart. Atsa looked up and saw her. He seemed, for the first time, flustered. He was not used to such open attention, either from the girl or from Eliza. He tucked his hand into his pocket, hiding the bracelet. The town was watching them. Eliza realized it. When she stood near him, the settlers stared. They looked at her with curiosity. They looked at him with suspicion and a strange, grudging interest. The dynamic had shifted. They were a pair, in the town's eyes, and it was a dangerous, volatile thing to be. That evening, Eliza could not bear the town. She could not bear the thought of the dance. She slipped away, taking the long path to Doña Marisol's quiet adobe. He was already there. He was sitting on the porch bench, watching the sun bleed into the western mesas. He had known she would come. She sat on the other end of the bench, the silence stretched, filled only by the evening insects. Who was she? Eliza asked, and hated the sound of her own voice. Rosita, he said, Miguel's sister. She is very beautiful. He did not reply. They sat. The tension between them was a third presence. It was the unresolved memory of the riverbank, the new, raw jealousy, and the crushing weight of the coming night. Atsa had learned something new. He had been slipped a note from Benny, the young Navajo who worked off a debt at the saloon. Benny was a distant cousin. The note contained another map. Ren's plan is bigger, Atsa said, his voice low in the twilight. Benny heard Jed Lowe, the scarred man, talking. Ren is not just diverting the Ojo. He is drying it up. He owns the land at a second, smaller spring, 2 miles south. If the Ojo is gone, his spring becomes the only water. He will own the entire valley. The sheer audacity of the plan staggered her. He will destroy everything. Yes. The danger, the shared purpose, the confusing, unspoken thing between them. It was too much. Eliza felt a sudden, desperate need for clarity, for one true thing in this world of lies. Her right hand was resting on the rough wood of the bench. She moved it, slowly, and laid it over his. He went completely still. His hand was warm, his skin rough from work and sun. He did not pull away. He did not move. Then, slowly, he turned his hand over, his palm meeting hers. His fingers were strong. He turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were dark, searching her face in the deep purple light. His voice was very quiet, barely a breath. Eliza, is this all right? She looked at his mouth, so close to hers. She could feel the heat of his skin. She was terrified, but she was more afraid of turning away. She nodded, yes. He leaned in, his movements as slow and deliberate as they had been at the river. He gave her every chance to stop him, to turn her head. She did not. His lips touched hers. It was brief. It was not a kiss of passion, but of contact. It was firm and dry and warm. It was a question and an answer, a promise, a single shared breath in a world that was trying to tear them apart. He pulled back, but he did not let go of her hand. They sat, their hands clasped, as the first stars appeared. They returned to the town separately. As the fiddle music from the Copper Lily began to cut through the night, the dance had begun. Eliza went to the church. Sister Agnes was there, waiting. She had set up a small table with a pitcher of water and a few pieces of bread, turning the sacristy into a temporary schoolroom. Eliza was just sitting down, the weight of the day, the kiss, the looming threat of Friday, settling on her, when the sound came, a sharp crack, followed by the tinkle of shattering glass. A rock arced through the broken window and thudded onto the wooden floor. Sister Agnes gasped. Eliza was not afraid. She was incandescent with a cold, clear rage. She stood, walked over, and picked up the stone. It was a smooth river rock. Painted on it, in crude white letters, were 2 words. Go east. Friday, Sister Agnes whispered. crossing herself. Tomorrow. I know, Eliza said. She held the rock in her good hand. I will not go east, and I will not wait for tomorrow. She walked out of the church. The air was cool, the music from the copper lily spilling across the street. She heard the sound of laughter and stamping feet. She crossed the street, her footsteps silent in the dust. She walked up the steps of the saloon and stood in the doorway. The music stopped. The fiddle whined into silence. Every eye in the room turned to her. Silas Wren stood in the center of the room, a glass of whiskey in his hand. When he saw her, his face lit up with a look of pure, arrogant triumph. He thought she had come for his invitation. He thought he had won. "Miss Hart," he boomed, his voice magnanimous, "you are late, but welcome. Come, you have missed the first waltz, but the night is young." He held out his free hand to her. Eliza stood still in the doorway. Her left arm was in its sling. Her good hand was clenched at her side. "No, Mr. Wren," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence of the saloon like a razor. Silas's smile faltered. "I will not dance with you," Eliza said. "Not tonight, not ever." A collective gasp went through the room. "I will not be the face of your project," she continued, stepping just inside the room. "I will not be the sugar for your poison, and I will not be threatened." She held up the rock, the white letters stark in the lamplight. "Go east." Wren's face darkened, his mask of charm dissolving into pure malice. "This is your last warning, Mr. Wren," Eliza said, her voice shaking but strong. "Mine is just beginning. The blast you have planned for tomorrow night, it will not happen. We know everything, and we will stop you." She turned, not waiting for a reply, and walked out of the saloon, leaving a stunned, deathly silence behind her. The battle line had been drawn, not in the shadows, but in the center of his own room, in front of the entire town. Friday night was a drumbeat. The wind had risen, as Eliza's public defiance at the saloon had promised. It was a dry, high desert wind that scoured the single street of San Miguel Wash, whipping dust and grit against the dark windows. It carried the sharp, electric smell of ozone, a false promise of rain. The moon was a pale, broken fingernail, offering no light. They met in the deepest shadow of Miguel Ortega's forge. Not 5 of them, but 3. Sister Agnes and Doña Marisol would remain at the church, a vigil of 2, tending a low fire, preparing bandages. They were the anchor, the place to return to. Miguel was dressed in dark canvas, his face set in grim lines. He tested the oiled jaws of a pair of heavy iron cutters. He had a coil of rope slung over his broad shoulder. Atza materialized from the darkness. He was not a man, but a part of the night. He carried his rifle, its barrel dull, and the small leather pouch of herbs. He had checked his weapon. His face was a mask of cold resolve. He was a man who hated waste, who wanted to build, but tonight he would have to do the work of unmaking. Eliza felt a tremor in her good hand. Her left arm was a painful, useless weight, bound tightly in its sling. She felt exposed, a fraud in her dark wool skirt, a teacher pretending to be a soldier, but in her right hand, she gripped the heavy wooden handle of the camera box. It was her weapon. She also carried a bullseye lantern, its brass lens capped, its oil can full. She was here to be the eye. "Now," Atza said. His voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the wind. He led them north, not on any road, but through the broken land, following washes and contours of the rock that only he could see. They moved in silence. The only sound was the wind and the scrape of Eliza's boots on the gravel. She focused on the shadow of Atza's back, planting her feet where he had planted his. The work site at the Little Colorado was changed. In the single day since their scouting, Wren's men had been brutally efficient. A dark, gaping mouth had been blasted into the canyon wall. It was a tunnel, shored up with the raw, skeletal limbs of dead cottonwood trees. Atza held up his hand. They froze. He listened. The high whine of the wind, the distant rushing sound of the river. Nothing else. "They are not at the mouth," he whispered, his lips close to Eliza's ear. "They are inside, guarding the detonator." He lit a small, shielded candle, its flame barely surviving the wind. He handed it to Miguel. "You first, I will be last." Miguel ducked into the tunnel. Eliza followed, her heart hammering against her ribs. The air inside was still and cold, smelling of freshly broken rock and damp earth. Atza came last, his rifle ready. The tunnel was low. Eliza had to stoop, her good shoulder aching from the camera's weight. It ran perhaps 50 feet straight into the mesa, ending in a small, man-made chamber. The candlelight flickered over the scene. It was all there. Stacked against the far wall were the wooden boxes, their stenciled letters stark and black A and SFRR. Dynamite. Wires, black and thin as spider silk, ran from the boxes to a crude wooden table. On the table sat the detonator, a wooden box with a plunger, and beside it, its brass gears ticking, was a large clock. The sound was deafening in the small space, a mechanical heartbeat counting down. The hands showed 1 o'clock. They had, perhaps, 1 hour. "The wires," Atza breathed. "Miguel." Miguel moved forward, lifting the iron cutters. "I would not do that, blacksmith." The voice was a low growl, coming from the deepest blackness in the corner of the chamber. A shadow detached itself from the wall. Jed Lowe, the scarred regulator, stepped into the light. He held a lantern in one hand and a heavy Colt revolver in the other. His thumb was already resting on the hammer. "I knew you fools would try something." Lowe sneered. His dead eyes flicked to Eliza. "Silas said you had spirit, girl, but this is just stupidity." Atza moved, placing his body between Lova and Eliza. It was a small, instinctive shift. His own rifle was in his hand, but it was pointed at the floor. He was too late. He could not raise it. "Loa," Atza said. His voice was preternaturally calm. "There is a woman here. There is no need for this. Put the gun down. We are only here to stop you." "You are here to die," Lowe said, his voice flat. "The boss said you were a problem. I am here to solve problems." "This is a federal crime," Eliza said, her voice shaking but finding its strength. Lowe laughed, a short, ugly bark. "The only crime here is trespassing. Girl, and Silas Wren is the law." He raised the revolver, its dark eyes centering on Atza's chest. "You first, Injun, then your friend. We will leave the school teacher for the boss to find. He likes his prizes." He spat on the stone floor. "Make your move." The air was thick, unbreathable. Miguel was frozen, his cutters useless. Eliza was trapped behind Atza. A new sound, a scrape of a boot from the tunnel entrance behind them. Lowe's eyes flickered, his aim shifting for a fraction of a second. "Who is that?" "Just me, Jefe," a young, nervous voice replied. Benny, the young Navajo from the saloon, stepped into the candlelight. He was holding a rifle. Lowe's face relaxed into its sneer. "Get over here, kid. You are just in time to watch me clean up this mess." Benny walked forward, his eyes wide. He looked at Atza, then at Eliza, then at Jed Lowe. "Atza," he said, his voice trembling. "He is my cousin." Lowe's face tightened. "What did you just say?" "He is my mother's family," Benny said, his voice finding a sudden, high strength. He raised his rifle, its barrel pointing at Lowe. "You little snake," Lowe snarled, swinging his revolver from Atza to Benny. It happened in a single chaotic instant. A shot exploded in the confined space. It was not from Lowe's gun. It was from Benny's. The bullet did not hit Lowe. It hit the lantern in Lowe's hand. The lantern exploded in a spray of glass and burning oil. The chamber was plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. "Now," Miguel Atza roared. Miguel lunged for the table, his cutters finding the wires by feel, by memory. Snip, snip. Eliza reacted, Her mind did not think, her body did. She raised the bullseye lantern with her good hand, aimed it at the sound of the struggle, and uncapped the lens. A brilliant, harsh beam of white light cut the blackness. At the same instant, she lifted the camera box, steadying it on her hip. She found the shutter release. Click! A chemical flash detonated, a blinding magnesium flare that lit the chamber like a miniature sun. For one heartbeat, everything was frozen Jed low, his face a mask of primal rage. Lunging. Miguel, holding the severed wires. Atza, his arm out, not attacking, but shoving low sideways, away from the table, away from the detonator. The flash faded, leaving green spots dancing in Eliza's vision. In the chaos, Atza's shove sent Loa crashing into the shoring timbers that held up the tunnel wall. A heavy, half-rotten cottonwood beam was dislodged. It fell, striking Atza high on his left shoulder, the exact spot of his old, puckered scar. He cried out, a sharp, choked sound that was cut off as he fell to one knee. His rifle clattered on the stone floor. Atza Eliza screamed. She ran to him, her lantern beam finding his face. He was pale, his teeth gritted in an agony that contorted his features. The shoulder, he breathed, the old wound. She saw it. The force of the blow had torn the old scar tissue. Fresh, dark blood was already soaking through his shirt, a stain spreading in the lantern light. Miguel, watch low, Eliza commanded. Her panic vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. She dropped the camera. With her good hand and her teeth, she ripped a long strip of cloth from her petticoat. She wadded it and pressed it hard against the bleeding, pushing against the ruined muscle. Miguel was already on top of the dazed regulator, tying his hands with the rope. Benny stood over them, his rifle shaking, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the air. Clang, 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 clang! Faintly, from the town, carried on the wind, came the sound of the church bell. Sister Agnes, the signal. She had heard the shot. The sheriff was coming. We have to move, Miguel panted, pulling the groaning Jed low to his feet. The camera, Eliza said, her hand sticky with Atza's blood. I must get the rest. She fumbled, her good hand slick, changing the glass plate. It was a nightmare of clumsiness. She steadied the box. She aimed it at the bound Jed low, at the severed wires on the table, at the stacked boxes of dynamite. Click! The flash lit the tunnel a second time. Benny, Atza said, his voice weak. He was leaning heavily on Eliza, his weight almost too much for her. You are in great danger. He has my mother, Benny said, the words spilling out, his voice breaking. Ren, he took her, for my father's debt. He holds her at the old line shack, by the South Spring. He said he would let her go if I worked, if I watched. Then you will testify, Eliza said, her voice hard as the rock around them. You will tell the sheriff. You will tell everyone. It is the only way to free her. I will, Benny said, his face set. They stumbled out of the tunnel, a strange procession, into the windy night. They were met by a line of bobbing lanterns. Sheriff Doolin was in the lead, a shotgun held across his chest. He looked pale and sick. Behind him were a dozen men from the town, settlers and Mexicans, drawn by the bell and the echo of the gunshot. In God's name, Doolin began, his voice failing as he took in the scene. The bound regulator, the wounded Navajo, the soot-stained, bloody teacher. Sheriff Doolin, Eliza said, her voice ringing with an authority she did not know she possessed. We have stopped them. We have Jed low, caught in the act of igniting railroad explosives to destroy the river. That is a lie, Lowe spat, finding his voice. They attacked me. They are saboteurs. We have photographs, Eliza said, holding up the camera, of him, the explosives, and the detonator, and we have a witness. She nodded to Benny. Before Doolin could form a reply, a new voice cut through the wind. It was smooth, cold, and utterly calm. Sheriff Doolin, What is the meaning of this armed mob trespassing on my property? Silas Wren rode into the circle of lantern light. He was mounted on a tall, black horse, and he was not alone. Beside him sat his lawyer, a thin, pale man in a city suit, carrying a leather briefcase. Wren looked perfectly at ease, as if he had just arrived for a Sunday social. "Mr. Wren," Doolin stammered, there has been a complaint, an accusation." "An accusation," Wren smiled, a gesture that did not touch his eyes. "I see what has happened. This vagrant and his criminal friends have been caught sabotaging a legal, private construction project. They have assaulted my foreman, Mr. Lowe, Sheriff. I am pressing charges." The crowd murmured. Legal construction, sabotage. The words had power. The lawyer dismounted, opening his briefcase. "Sheriff, we have here the water appropriation contracts, signed by Mayor Crowley and the town council, filed 2 months ago. We have the freight invoices for the explosives, leased legally from the railroad. Everything is in order. These people are dangerous fanatics." Doolin was paralyzed. He looked at the sheaf of official papers in the lawyer's hand. He looked at the bleeding Atsa. He looked at the bound Jed Lowe. The paper was the law. He lied, Benny stammered. "He was drying up the Oho. He said it was for the railroad, but he was sending the water to his own spring. He told me." The word of a bondservant, Wren scoffed, his voice dripping with contempt. "He works for me to pay off his family's thieving. His testimony is worthless." "It is a lie," Eliza shouted. "Quiet, Miss Hart," Wren said, his voice still soft, but with a new, venomous edge. "Your public hysteria is noted. It will make for a sad defense. Sheriff, arrest them." Doolin looked at his shotgun. He looked at the crowd. He was a weak man, trapped between a clear wrong and a powerful, paper-thin right. Silas held the paper. "Sheriff," Silas pressed, his voice hardening, "do your duty." "No." The voice was not loud, but it cut through the wind and the indecision. It was Atsa. He pushed himself away from Eliza, standing on his own. His body was rigid with pain, but his eyes were on fire. He looked, not at Wren, but at the crowd, at the settlers, at the Mexican families, at the small ranchers who had been silent for so long. "He speaks of paper," Atsa said, his voice gaining strength with every word. "I speak of water. Look at this ditch. Look at these boxes of poison. This is not construction. This is a grave. He is here to kill the river, to kill the Oho." He took a single painful step forward. "This water, it feeds my people. It feeds Miguel's forge. It feeds your cattle, Mr. Estes. It feeds your children, Mrs. Gable. It has fed all of us. For all time, it belongs to no one man." He turned his burning gaze on Silas Wren. "This paper you hold, it is a lie, bought with whiskey and fear. The water does not know your name. It knows the people. It knows the land, and we will not let you kill it." A deep, dangerous silence fell. The wind itself seemed to hold its breath. The crowd looked at Atsa, and for the first time, they were not seeing an Indian. They were seeing a defender. Silas Wren saw the shift. He saw the doubt in Doolin's eyes. He saw the new, hard set of the rancher's jaws. He had lost them. He smiled. It was a brilliant, stunning pivot. "Such passion," he said, holding up his hands as if to calm a frightened animal. I see I have misjudged the town's deep feeling on this. I am not a tyrant. I am a partner." He looked at the crowd, his face a mask of reasonable, concerned leadership. "This man," he gestured to Atsa, "speaks of the people. Very well, then let the people decide." He turned to Doolin, offering him a lifeline. "Sheriff, there is a clear dispute here. The only fair, the only American way to settle this, is a town referendum. A vote. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. We will put it to the town. Progress and the railroad. Or this." He gestured to Atsa, his meaning clear. The crowd murmured again. A vote. It sounded fair. Yes, Mayor Crowley suddenly shouted, pushing his way through the crowd. A vote that is the proper, legal way, a democratic solution. Eliza saw the trap instantly. No, you cannot. He will rig it. It is a trick. Are you afraid of democracy? Miss Hart Wren asked, his voice smooth as oil. I will abide by the vote. Let us all meet in the town square. 9 o'clock. Sheriff Doolin, given a perfect legal escape, seized it. A vote. Yes, that is the way. Everyone go home, Mr. Wren, you will cease all work. Mr. Lowe, I am holding him in my custody. The rest of you, go home. We will settle this in the light of day. Silas Wren nodded, a satisfied, reptilian smile just touching his lips. He knew, and Eliza knew, that he already owned the votes. He had bought them with his school, or he would beat them into submission before the sun rose. He had turned their victory into his own. He had taken their truth and offered a lie in return, and the town had accepted it. The sun rose at 9 o'clock on a town that felt like a tinderbox. The wind had died, but the air was brittle and heavy. This was not a vote. It was a performance of intimidation. 4 of Silas Wren's regulators, in their long dusters, stood on the porch of the Copper Lily Saloon. They did not speak. They just watched, their hands resting on their holstered guns. Mayor Crowley stood beside them at a small, rough table. The ballots, slips of paper he had cut himself, were in a box. The ballot box was a whiskey crate. To vote, a citizen had to walk the length of the street, past those men, take a ballot from Crowley, and drop it in the crate. It was a joke, a secret vote held in the open, on the enemy's territory. The town gathered, but they did not move. They stood in a half-circle in the dusty street ranchers, settlers, and the Mexican families, all silent, all afraid. Atza stood near the front, his left arm bound in a clean white sling Sister Agnes had made. His face was pale from blood loss, but he stood straight. Miguel was beside him, his massive arms crossed. Eliza, her own sling a mirror of Atza's, was with them. Her camera, reloaded with a fresh plate, was in her hand. Let us begin, Mayor Crowley called out, his voice oily and false. Let us decide the future of San Miguel Wash. This referendum is a fraud, Eliza called out, her voice clear in the silence. It is the law, Miss Hart, Crowley retorted. Now, please, step forward and vote. She is correct. It is a fraud. The new voice was not Eliza's. It was Sister Agnes. She walked from the church, her gray habit stark against the red dust. She was not carrying her Bible. She was carrying the thick leather-bound book of territorial statutes. She walked directly into the center of the square, placing herself between the crowd and the saloon. Silas Wren has called for a vote based on a lie, she announced, her voice ringing with an authority that stopped everyone. He claims he is engaged in a legal construction project. But last night, his men were caught attempting to destroy a public waterway with stolen explosives. That is a lie, Crowley shouted. There is no proof. There is law, Sister Agnes countered. She held up the book. I will read it to you, so that you all may hear it. Territorial Statute, Title 4, Section 6, a federal law from Washington. She began to read, her voice strong and unwavering. Any person who shall willfully or maliciously destroy, impede, or divert the course of any public river, arroyo, or spring, for the purpose of private gain, shall be deemed guilty of a federal crime, and upon conviction, shall be imprisoned for a term of no less than 5 years. She closed the book with a sharp thud. The silence was absolute. She walked to Sheriff Doolin, who stood, paralyzed, near his office. She pressed the open book into his hands. This is no longer a town matter. Sheriff, she said, her voice loud for all to hear. It is a federal crime. You are bound by your oath. You must stop this illegal vote. You must investigate. You must seal that dynamite as evidence. Doolin looked at the book. He looked at Silas Wren, who was now standing on the saloon porch, his face like a thundercloud. He looked at the crowd. who were all watching him. He was trapped. She is right, Doolin stammered, his voice weak but finding its footing. This vote, it is suspended, pending an investigation. A low murmur went through the crowd. It was something. Suspended, Wren laughed. A harsh, ugly sound. On what grounds? Sheriff, the word of a nun and a savage. You have no evidence. Yes, we do. It was Eliza. She stepped forward, and Miguel moved with her. He was carrying a long length of laundry rope. He and Atza quickly strung the rope between two porch posts of the sheriff's office, directly across the front. What is this? Crowley demanded. Another of your hysterics. Miss Hart. Eliza ignored him. She reached into her bag and pulled out the glass plates, still damp from the cellar, one by one, with wooden clothespins. She hung them on the line. The 9 o'clock sun was now high enough. It streamed from the east, a perfect, brilliant light. It passed through the glass negatives, and on the whitewashed adobe wall of the sheriff's office, projected for the entire town to see, the images appeared. The crowd gasped. It was all there, in stark black and white, a line of surveyor's stakes, the close-up of the canvas bag, the letters A and SFRR stark and damning, the driftwood map, with its carved W horseshoe, the severed detonator wires, and the last picture, the one from the tunneled Jed Lowe, his face a mask of rage, his hands tied, sitting next to the open, wire-cut boxes of dynamite. It was the truth, written in light. He used the railroad's explosives, one of the ranchers murmured, his voice full of shock. That is his mark, the W brand. Another said, before Wren could speak, before he could form a new lie, another voice rose. And I know this. Doña Marisol stepped forward. She was a small, ancient figure, but she moved with a queen's dignity. In her hand, she held a small, stoppered glass vial. When they brought the regulator, the one with the scar, to the jail last night, I saw his hands, she said, her voice dry as leaves but carrying to every ear. They were stained, a deep purple. She held up the vial. Inside was a dark, thick liquid. This is anchusa, a root dye I use for my salves. It stains the skin for days. It is the same dye I use to waterproof the canvas bags for my herbs. She pointed a thin, trembling finger at the projected image of the dynamite. The same bags he stole from my shed, that he filled with his poison. His hands are stained with his crime. Go, Sheriff, look at your prisoner. This new proof, so simple, so physical, was a hammer blow. The crowd was no longer murmuring. They were growing loud, their fear turning to a low, collective growl. It is true! It is all true! The shout came from Benny. He had been standing near the jail, guarded by one of Doolin's deputies. He broke free and ran into the middle of the square, his face a mask of terror and desperate resolve. Wren is a monster, he cried, pointing at Silas. He holds my mother. My mother, he took her, for a debt my father owed. He holds her at the old line shack. At his South Spring, he told me he would free her if I worked for him. If I spied on Atza. If I helped him, he lied. He said he would kill her if I spoke. Kidnapping. Holding a mother hostage. The word ripped through the crowd. This was not about water anymore. This was a violation of the most basic human law. The settlers, the wives, the Mexican families, their faces hardened. The last shred of support for Silas Wren vanished. Atza, his face grim, stepped forward until he was inches from Doolin. Sheriff, you have heard the testimony. That is kidnapping. That is a federal crime. Your investigation must begin now. He looked at the crowd, then back at Doolin. I am going to get his mother. I am with you, Miguel boomed, stepping to his side. A rancher stepped forward, and then another, and another. Within seconds, a dozen men, armed with rifles and a cold fury, had formed a line beside Atza. They were all looking at Doolin, The sheriff looked at the ground. He looked at the angry faces of the men. He looked at the cold, murderous rage in Silas Wren's eyes. He took a deep, shuddering breath. He was a weak man, but in that moment, he made a choice. He slowly, deliberately, unpinned the tin star from his vest. He looked at it, then, with a firm, final motion, he pinned it back on, straighter this time. "Mr. Wren's referendum is over," Doolin announced. His voice, for the first time, loud and clear. "This is a crime scene." He looked at the men. "Atza Nez, Miguel Ortega. I am forming a posse to investigate a kidnapping and to secure the prisoner. You are all deputized." He handed Atza a second, tarnished badge from his pocket. Silas Wren had been watching this all from his horse, his lawyer whimpering beside him. His mask of civility was gone, burned away. His face was a knot of pure, animalistic fury. He saw Atza. He saw the man who had undone him. The man he called a savage, now standing tall, a badge of the law pinned to his chest. "No," Wren roared, his voice cracking. "No damn Injun will ever arrest me." In one violent motion, he ripped his repeating rifle from the scabbard on his saddle. He levered a round into the chamber and aimed it, not at Doolin, but straight at Atza's heart. Eliza had never stopped watching him. She had been framing him through the simple viewfinder of her camera, a habit now. She saw the glint of the barrel. She saw the shift in his shoulders. She saw his eyes squint down the sight. "Atza, no!" she screamed, her voice a raw shriek of terror. Atza reacted to her voice, not the threat. He did not look. He dove sideways. The rifle shot cracked across the square. The bullet hissed through the exact space where his chest had been, punching a hole through the brim of his hat. Before Wren could lever a second round, Miguel Ortega, who had already been moving, launched himself. With a roar that came from his very boots, he grabbed Wren's leg and, with all the power of his blacksmith's arms, tore him from the saddle. Wren crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs, his head striking the hitching rail. The rifle flew from his grasp. The other regulators, the four on the porch, had their hands on their guns, but they were looking at the dozen rifles of the posse. They were looking at their leader, disarmed and on the ground. This was not a fight. It was a rout. Their pay was not worth this. One by one, they backed away, turned, and spurred their horses down the street, fleeing the town in a cloud of ignominious dust. Sheriff Doolin, his own shotgun now steady in his hands, walked over to the sputtering, cursing Silas Wren. He pulled a pair of iron handcuffs from his belt. "Silas Wren," Doolin said, his voice loud for all to hear. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to destroy public property, for kidnapping, and for the attempted murder of a deputized officer of this territory." The crowd surged, a roar of relief and anger. Atza got to his feet, his hand automatically going to his wounded shoulder. He was shaken, the hole in his hat a cold reminder of how close it had been. He looked for Eliza. She was standing frozen, the heavy camera hanging forgotten from her good arm. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with the raw, visceral terror of having almost seen him die. He saw that terror. He saw it was for him. The crowd, the sheriff, the arrest. It all faded away. There was only her. He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides, in front of the entire town, in the bright, unforgiving morning sun. He did not hesitate. He pulled her to him. Eliza collapsed against his chest, her good arm wrapping fiercely around his waist, her hand clutching the back of his shirt. She buried her face in the rough cotton, breathing in the scent of him, of dust and sweat and safety. She was trembling violently. Atza held her just as tightly, his good arm encircling her, his hand pressing her head to his chest. He held her, shielding her, claiming her, letting his own racing heart slow against hers. There was no more pretense. There was no more hiding. The referendum was over. The investigation had begun. The Ojo, for now, was safe. The night was a fragile, breathing thing, After the rescue of Benny's mother, a gaunt, terrified woman found huddled in the line shack and the secure locking of Silas Wren and Jed Lowe in Doolin's jail. A profound, exhausted quiet settled over San Miguel Wash. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind the deep, pulsing ache of wounds and the hollow shock of what had been averted. Sister Agnes had stitched Atsa's shoulder, her needle quick and sure. Doña Marisol had covered the fresh stitches with a poultice of comfrey and willow bark. His left arm was now bound tightly to his chest. He and Eliza were a matched set, two figures marked by the fight, each with one arm rendered useless. Eliza could not be indoors. The small room at the church felt like a cage. She had walked, her feet carrying her without thought, to the source, to El Ojo del Rio. The great spring was a short distance from the town, a wide, clear pool of water that bubbled up from the earth before narrowing into the stream that fed the valley. It was the heart. It was what they had fought for. He was already there. He was sitting on a flat stone, his back to her, looking at the water. Even in the pale moonlight, she could see the rigid set of his shoulders. She did not make a sound, but he knew she was there. "You should be resting," he said, his voice quiet. He did not turn around. "So should you." She came to stand beside the pool, looking at the reflection of the broken moon on its surface. "Is she, Benny's mother, is she safe?" "She is with Doña Marisol. She is safe." The silence stretched, filled by the soft, constant music of the spring. It was the sound of life itself. "I was afraid today," Eliza said, her voice barely a whisper. She was not talking about the regulators, or the tunnel. When he raised his rifle, "I saw your face, and then he fired." Atsa turned his head to look at her. His face was shadowed, his expression impossible to read. "I heard your voice. It is what saved me." "I thought he had killed you," she said, her own voice trembling as the memory returned. "I thought I had brought you to this, and you were gone." He stood, slowly, his movements stiff with pain. He came to her, stopping a foot away. He could see the tracks of tears on her dusty cheeks. "Eliza," he said, his voice low and rough. "I was not afraid of his bullet. In that tunnel, when the beam fell, all I could think was that I would not see you again, that I had waited my whole life to find something, and I would lose it in the dark." He looked away from her, at the bubbling water. "I told you I wanted to be a healer, to build. I have been a man alone for a long time. It is a cold, empty way to live. I want to build a house, Eliza, a small, strong house, with thick adobe walls. I want a garden, corn, beans, and squash. The three sisters, they grow together. They help each other. I want—" He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "I want a school," he said, the confession rushing out of him. "Not just your school. A room, a place where the children, Navajo, Mexican, Anglo, can all come. A place where they can learn their own languages and the new ones. A place that is safe." He looked at her, his eyes burning with a lifetime of unspoken hope. "I want to build this, but I cannot build it alone." The scale of his dream, so simple and yet so vast, filled her. It matched a hollow she had not known she possessed. He was not just offering his heart. He was offering a future, a purpose. She met his gaze, her own fear and doubt solidifying into resolve. "Then we will build it," she said, her voice firm. "But we will do it slow, and we will do it right. No more running, no more fighting. If we can help it, we build." This was her choice, her mature consent. She, who had come west to be independent, now understood that true freedom was not being alone. It was choosing who to bind yourself to. She stepped forward, closing the small space between them. She raised her good hand and laid it on his chest. She could feel the steady, strong beat of his heart beneath her palm. "Atsa," she whispered. He did not ask permission this time. He did not need to. He bent his head, and his mouth found hers. It was not like the first, brief kiss on the porch. This was a kiss of aftermath, of survival, of promise. It was deep and slow. It tasted of the mineral water and the desert dust, and of a profound, bone-deep relief. He held her, his good arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her close, anchoring her. She leaned into him, her splinted arm pressed between their bodies, her good hand moving from his chest to his neck, her fingers tangling in his long, soft hair. It was a kiss that held all the fear of the day and all the hope of the life he had just described. When he finally lifted his head, they were both breathless. They rested their foreheads together.
"The town,"
Eliza whispered.
"the cold reality intruding. They will not make it easy. They saw us, today, in the street."
"I know. They will have names for me. For a woman who chooses you." "I know," he said again, his voice pained. She pulled back just enough to look him in the eyes, her hand still cupping his face, then let them.
"My father told me to choose my own way. I will not have a love that must be hidden in the shadows. If this is my choice, I will make it in the sun. If love must be hidden, it is not freedom."
His heart ached at her bravery. He kissed her forehead, a gesture of pure reverence. He looked down at his sling. The white linen was stained, a dark, ugly patch where his wound had wept through. He began to unknot it with his good hand.
"What are you doing?"
she asked. "Sister Agnes will be angry," he said. "But this, it holds the last of the fight." He worked the knot free and pulled the blood-stained bandage from his arm. He knelt by the ojo, by the place where the water bubbled, clean and pure, from the earth. He dipped the dark cloth into the current. The blood swirled, dissolving, turning pink and then vanishing, carried away by the stream. He held the cloth under the water until it was white again. Then he opened his hand. They watched together as the strip of linen tumbled in the current, a small white flag of surrender. It moved down the stream and disappeared into the darkness. A release, a cleansing. "It is done," he said. "It is done." A twig snapped behind them. They turned, Atsa's hand moving to the knife he still wore at his belt. Doña Marisol stood there, a shawl around her shoulders. She was not smiling, but her ancient eyes were soft. She had seen. She had been waiting.
"The water takes what is bad,"
she said, her voice like a dry rustle.
"Now, you must bind what is good."
She held out her hand. In her palm was a spool of simple, bright red thread. She took Eliza's right hand, her good one. She took Atsa's right hand. She placed their wrists one on top of the other, his over hers, palm to palm. With deft, practiced fingers, she wrapped the red thread around both their wrists, binding them together. She wound it 7 times, her lips moving, whispering a blessing in a mixture of Spanish and some older, native word Eliza did not know. She tied a small, tight knot.
"This is not a priest's rope,"
Doña Marisol said, stepping back. "It is not a judge's paper. It is thread. It is weak. You must make it strong. Every day. You must choose. Every day. Not to break it. Entiendes?"
"We understand,"
Eliza said, her voice thick. Atsa looked at their bound hands. "We understand." The next morning, the town was a different place. The air was clear. The threat was gone, caged in the sheriff's office. Eliza and Atsa, the red thread still on their wrists, walked to the sheriff's office. Doolin was outside, loading his horse. He looked tired, but he also looked like a man who had finally slept well. He nodded to them, his eyes respectful. "Morning, Miss Hart, Atsa." He checked the cinch on his saddle. "I am riding out, taking Renan Lowe to Santa Fe, to the federal marshal."
"You are going alone?"
Eliza asked, alarmed. "No, ma'am." Miguel stepped out of the forge, his face clean, his rifle in his hand. Sister Agnes was with him, handing him a packet of food and a canteen. "Miguel will ride with me, and Sister Agnes is coming, to make sure the marshal understands her federal law." Doolin looked at his boots.
"I spent a long time bowing to money. Miss Hart, I am done. It is time I bowed to the badge." He tipped his hat, a gesture of genuine respect, and mounted his horse. As they rode out, the small procession was watched by the town. Some people looked away, their face sullen. They had bet on Wren on the easy money of the railroad, and they had lost. But others nodded. Mrs. Gable, the rancher's wife, stepped out and handed Sister Agnes a small, wrapped Bible. "Godspeed, sister," she said. Later that day, as Eliza was sweeping the church porch, 3 children, 2 Mexican and 1 white, approached her. They were clutching a single, battered primer. "Ma'am," the oldest boy asked, "is it true? Are you really going to make a school?" Eliza's heart felt too large for her chest. She knelt. Yes, I am. We can start right here. Today." An hour later, Miguel returned. His horse lathered. He was carrying something large and awkward. It was a set of bookshelves, built of fresh, pale pine. The joints were rough, but they were strong. "For the school," he said, his face breaking into a wide grin. He set it against the wall of the church, and the sound of it hitting the wood was solid and real. To build. Eliza looked at the empty shelves, her eyes filling with tears. That evening, Atza came to her on the porch. The children were gone. The shelves were waiting. "I must go," he said, his voice heavy. Her heart stopped. Go, or you we just... He took her hand, his thumb rubbing the red thread on her wrist. "Not go, not leave. I must make a journey. It will be a few days, maybe a week." "Why?" "I must go to the place where my mother is buried. I must tell her. About you. About the house. I must ask her blessing." He looked to the north, toward the high, distant mesas of his people. "And I must find my uncle, the one who was beaten. I must tell him that the man who did it is in chains. And I must ask his blessing, too." He was not abandoning her. He was honoring her, by honoring his own. He was bringing her into his family, into his K. Eliza understood. It was a pain, this sudden separation, but it was a good, true pain. "You will come back," she said. It was not a question. "I will come back," he said. He kissed her, a long, deep kiss that was full of promise and the ache of a short goodbye. She watched him walk away, his figure growing smaller in the twilight, until he blended with the desert. The next morning, Eliza Hart, her arm still in its sling, a red thread on her wrist, took a piece of chalk and a slate. She walked onto the porch of the small adobe church, where her new bookshelves stood. 5 children were waiting for her. The next day, there were 7. She sat them in a circle and began. The sound of their voices, shyly reciting the alphabet, mingled with the constant, steady, life-giving sound of the spring. She was alone, but she was not lonely. She was building, and she was waiting. The week Atza was gone was the longest and busiest of Eliza's life. She measured the days not by the sun, but by the lessons on the church porch. The town of San Miguel Wash held its breath, suspended between the violence of its recent past and the uncertainty of its future. The small party, Sheriff Doolin, Sister Agnes, and Miguel Ortega had departed with their prisoners. Silas Wren and Jed Lowe, bound tightly in the back of a freight wagon. The ride to Santa Fe was fraught, as they had suspected. 3 of Wren's remaining regulators, the ones who had fled the town, attempted an ambush at the narrow Gila Pass, but they had expected to fight the old Sheriff Doolin, a man weary and compromised. They were not prepared for the man he had become. They were not prepared for Miguel Ortega, who returned their fire with the steady, furious precision of a man defending his home. And they were certainly not prepared for Sister Agnes, who, when one of the men tried to circle behind them, calmly lifted Doolin's spare rifle and fired a single, perfect shot into the rock just above his head, sending stone chips spraying into his face. The fight was over in less than 2 minutes. 1 regulator was captured, his arm broken. The other 2 fled east.
disappearing into the territory, cowed and defeated. The prisoners were delivered to the federal marshal in Santa Fe. Sister Agnes and Miguel returned 10 days later, their horses lathered, their faces streaked with dust, but their eyes bright with triumph. The town gathered at the forge to hear the news. It spread from that hot, sooty spot like a cleansing fire. The federal judge in Santa Fe had seen Eliza's glass plates. He had read the federal statute that Sister Agnes had pressed into his hand. He had listened to Sheriff Doolin's testimony, and to Benny's. The case was accepted. Silas Wren and Jed Lowe were in a federal cell, awaiting a trial they would undoubtedly lose. The judge's orders were absolute. All of Silas Wren's assets were seized by the United States government. His equipment, his wagons, his tools, his cattle, and the dam site itself were impounded. A federal investigator was being sent to San Miguel Wash, not just to manage the assets, but to look into the financial irregularities of the town council. Mayor Crowley, upon hearing this, was suddenly and violently ill. He packed 2 bags in the middle of the night and fled, his illness apparently cured by the promise of an eastbound stage. The town was, for the first time in a decade, free of his shadow. The change was immediate. It was as if the town itself took a deep, collective breath. The oppressive weight of fear lifted. A new town meeting was called, this time held on the steps of the church. In the open air, they held a real vote. The Ojo del Rio, and the watershed that fed it, was declared by unanimous consent to be the permanent, protected property of the community. They resurrected the old Spanish system, a junta, a water council, to ensure fair sharing and conservation during the dry season. Miguel Ortega, his voice booming with authority, was elected to lead it. Eliza's school, the one that had begun as a lie, became the town's new, vibrant truth. It grew. Miguel and 2 of the ranchers, Mr. Gable and Mr. Estes, built 3 rough-hewn tables and 6 long benches. They were made from the stacks of expensive pine timber Wren had freighted in for his dam. The classroom was still the church porch, but it felt solid now. Her student count grew from 7 to 12. The Gables sent their son, the Ortegas their 2 daughters, and 3 more children from the small farms now came every day. She hung the glass plate negatives in the small window of the sacristy. When the morning sun shone through, the images were projected onto the whitewashed wall, the surveyor's stakes, the W brand on the driftwood, the cut detonator wires. The children, fascinated, asked her what they were. "It is a lesson," Eliza said, her voice quiet, her good hand resting on the shoulder of the smallest girl. "It is the story of what happens when one person tries to own what belongs to everyone. It is a reminder of what we almost lost." She was correcting slates late one afternoon when she felt the air change. A stillness. The children, sensing her distraction, looked up from their work, one by one. He was just there, standing at the edge of the street, in the same spot where she had first seen him, watching them. He had been gone for 2 weeks. He was thinner, the lines of his face starker, and he looked weary from a long, hard journey, but his shoulders were straight. He was not the haunted man who had hidden in the shadows of the town. A deep, quiet peace had settled on him. Eliza's heart did a slow, painful turn in her chest. She dismissed the children, her voice unsteady. They ran off, laughing, stealing glances at the Navajo man who had become their town's quiet hero. Eliza walked toward him. She did not run. Her days of running were over. He met her halfway, in the middle of the dusty street. They did not speak for a long moment. He just took her good hand in his. His was warm and rough. The red thread Doña Marisol had tied around her wrist was faded and worn, but it was still there. He touched it with his thumb. They sat on the church steps, in the center of her new school. "I was gone long," he said, his voice low. "My uncle, he lives far near the Chusca Mountains. He is a healer. He gave his blessing." "And your mother's grave?" Eliza asked, her voice soft. "I told her," he said, looking at his hands. "I told her about the spring, and I told her about you." He reached for the leather pouch at his hip, the one he had once used for herbs. He opened it and poured a small, precious stream of seeds into her open palm. There were kernels of dark blue corn, a handful of small, mottled red beans, and a dozen flat, pale green squash seeds.
"The 3 sisters,"
Eliza whispered, her throat tightening. She remembered the story he had told her by the river, of the garden he wanted to build.
"They grow together," he said, his voice steady. "They help each other. My uncle gave them to me. He said it was time to plant."
He had brought her a shared future. Then he offered her his past. He drew a small knife from a beaded sheath on his belt. It was not a weapon. The blade was thin and curved, worn from use. The handle was of dark, polished wood, rubbed smooth by a hand that was now dust. "This was my mother's," he said. "She used it for her herbs, to cut roots, to heal, not to harm." He placed it in Eliza's hand. It was an offering of his lineage, his deepest trust, his entire self. Eliza closed her fingers around the worn handle. It felt impossibly warm. She looked at the empty bookshelves, at the town, at the man beside her. She thought of the girl in the gray wool dress, the one who had arrived in the dust, terrified and weak, a victim. She had believed, for so long, that Atsa had rescued her. She realized, in that moment, that was wrong. He had not rescued her. He had met her, he had offered a hand, and she had chosen, with her own strength, to take it. She had chosen to stay. She had chosen to face Silas Wren in the saloon. She had chosen to go to the tunnel. She had chosen this man, this town, this life. She had not been saved. She had, for the first time, saved herself. Atsa watched her, his eyes absorbing the sight of her, the teacher sitting on the steps of her school. He heard the sound of Miguel's hammer from the forge, the rhythmic clang no longer a warning signal, but the steady heartbeat of the town. He saw Doña Marisol and Benny's mother, sitting together in the shade of the church, grinding corn, their quiet laughter mixing with the sound of the spring. He was no longer the man on the ridge, the solitary scout, watching the dust of a world he despised. He was in the center of it, bound to it by shared work, by shared loss, and by the love of the woman beside him. He was not alone. He had found his kie, his family. The healing of the town began, not with words, but with work. Benny, pardoned by the federal marshal in exchange for his testimony, needed a place. His mother was safe, but they were destitute. Miguel Ortega, his forge now busier than ever, took the young man on. "A man who can shoot a lantern out of Jed Lowe's hand in the dark," the blacksmith boomed, his voice full of pride. "Can learn to strike hot iron." And they planted the garden. Not just Atsa. He showed them where, on the rich, fertile land beside the Ojo. The land Wren had tried to steal, the land that was now theirs. The families came. Mr. Gable and his son, the Ortegas, with their bright-eyed daughter, Rosita, Benny and his mother, 2 other Navajo families, who had heard that the spring was safe again, came down from the mesas. They planted the 3 sisters. Navajo, Mexican, and Anglo hands worked side by side in the same dark, damp soil, planting a shared, fragile future. The scars of the town remained. Mayor Crowley was gone, but his shadow lingered. A few of the settlers who had backed Wren now kept to themselves, their faces sullen. They spoke of the railroad, which would now surely divert 20 miles to the north, a lost opportunity, a lost fortune. The poison of greed was not gone from the valley. It was only weakened. But the sound of life was stronger, the sound of Miguel's hammer, the sound of Doña Marisol singing an old Spanish lullaby as she worked, and, loudest of all, the sound of 12 children on the church porch, their voices rising and falling in recitation, laughing as they learned. Their voices, clear and bright, drowned out the lingering whispers of hatred and resentment. That afternoon, a new wind came, for the first time in months. It was heavy and damp, carrying the rich, deep smell of true rain. The sky turned a dark, bruised purple. Eliza and Atsa sat on the top step of the church porch, watching the sky. Their slings were gone. Their shoulders were stiff, and always would be. A permanent reminder. But they were healed. They sat close, their arms touching from shoulder to wrist. They watched the Ojo, the spring, its surface ruffled by the coming storm, the water lashing, alive and free. The house was the first thing they built. It was not a house, at first, but a ruin. An old, 2-room adobe near the Ojo that had been abandoned for 20 years. The roof was gone, and one wall had crumbled. Miguel Ortega, in the days after his return, declared it their project. Benny, now his apprentice, came with a new, sharp adze. Atsa, his shoulders stiff but strong, did the heavy work quarrying stone for the foundation and mixing the mud and straw for new bricks. The town watched. Then, one by one, they joined. Mr. Gable, the rancher, arrived with his freight wagon, piled high with thick vigas for the roof, timber he had salvaged from Wren's abandoned dam site. Mrs. Gable and Rosita came with pots of stew and fresh bread. Even Sheriff Doolin, his duty in Santa Fe done, spent an afternoon on the roof, hammering planks. The house rose from the red earth. A part of it, it had thick, strong walls that would be cool in the summer and warm in the winter. It had a wide, shaded porch that faced the spring. Inside, Eliza placed her few possessions. Miguel and Benny had built them a bookshelf, not from new pine, but from the old, splintered ammunition crates left by the army. Eliza filled it with her Shakespeare, her Virgil, and her primers in the small yard, where the earth was dark and rich from the spring. The 3 sisters were already tall. The corn formed a stockade, the beans climbed the stalks, and the wide, flat leaves of the squash shaded the ground, holding in the moisture. They did not have a wedding. There was no preacher. The town did not need one to understand. They stood, one afternoon, on their new porch. The entire town was there. Doña Marisol stood in the place of an elder, her hand on Benny's shoulder. Sister Agnes stood beside her, her hands clasped, her face glowing with a quiet joy. Miguel held a small cup, carved from wood. Atsa, dressed in a clean cotton shirt, his black hair loose on his shoulders, turned to Eliza. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair pinned up, the light catching the auburn in it. The red thread was still on her wrist. He took her hands. He looked at her, his eyes serious, holding all the memory of the river, the tunnel, the fear, and the hope. "I was a man of stone and dust," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying in the still air. "You gave me water. You gave me a home." Eliza's voice was thick with tears, but she did not weep. "I was a person of rules and pages," she replied, her hands gripping his. "You gave me the earth. You gave me a life." Miguel stepped forward and handed the cup to Atsa. It was filled with water, clear and cold, from the Ojo. Atsa held it up. "We will build," he said, his gaze meeting Eliza's. "Every day," she answered. He drank half the water. He passed the cup to her. She drank the other half. It was a vow, a commitment, a sharing of the life they had saved and the one they would now build. The news from Santa Fe came a month later, carried by the federal investigator. Justice, it turned out, was slow, but it was thorough. Silas Wren was convicted, with Eliza's photographs, Sister Agnes's law book, the testimony of Sheriff Doolin, and the damning first-hand account of Benny. The jury had taken less than 1 hour. He was found guilty on all counts: conspiracy, theft of federal property, kidnapping, and attempted murder. He was sentenced to 30 years in the federal prison at Yuma. He would never see the high desert again. The railroad, its name sullied by the scandal, publicly disavowed all of Wren's contracts. They formally rerouted their line 30 miles north, citing engineering concerns. The federal investigator, a precise man with a ledger, stayed for 2 months. He sold, at auction, every asset Silas Wren had owned, the cattle, the wagons, the tools, even the fine suits he had left behind. The money was placed in a new, federally managed fund, the San Miguel Wash Community Trust. Its first act was to fund the construction of a new, one-room building made of stone and pine, with real glass windows. It sat on the hill just above the Ojo, where the sound of the children could mix with the sound of the water. Eliza, her hand steady, painted the sign herself, on a single, smooth plank of pine. It was not a large sign. It said, in clean, black letters, "School by the River." She did not teach history only from her books. One day, she took all 15 of her students, Navajo, Mexican, and Anglo, on a walk. She led them to the Ojo, to the place where the spring bubbled from the rock. There, hidden by a tangle of wild roses, was the carving, the small, ancient handprint. One by one, she had the children place their own hands over it. "This is our first teacher," Eliza told them, her voice soft. "This was put here by the first people, to remember. It marks this water. It means this is life. It does not belong to one of us." She looked at their bright, upturned faces. "It belongs to all of us. This water feeds us all." That autumn, the harvest was rich. The three sisters' garden had produced more than Eliza and Atsa could eat. They held a feast, a fiesta, a gathering. It was not a holiday from a calendar, but one they made themselves. Atsa's uncle came down from the mountains, bringing his family and a drum. Miguel's family, Rosita included, brought 2 guitars and a small, sweet violin. The Gables and the other ranchers brought a side of beef, which was roasted over a pit of mesquite coals. Benny, whose mother now cooked for the forge, made a vast, bubbling pot of green chili stew, thick with corn and squash from the garden. They ate together as the sun set. The sound of the Navajo drumbeat wove through the high, sweet melody of the Mexican guitar. After the meal, Miguel pushed back the tables. Atsa's uncle began a soft, rhythmic chant, a song of harvest and gratitude. Then, Miguel drew his bow across the violin, striking up a fast, joyful corrido. His sister, Rosita, pulled Benny up to dance, and the young blacksmith, his face red but proud, spun her in a wild, laughing circle. Later, Mr. Gable, his face flushed, called out, "Play a waltz, man." Miguel laughed and changed the tune. The music slowed, becoming a simple, elegant 3-step. Atsa stood up. He walked to Eliza and held out his hand. "I do not know this one," he whispered, his face serious. "I do," she whispered back. "It is easy. 1, 2, 3. She placed her hand in his. He put his good arm around her waist, and she put hers on his scarred shoulder. And there, in the firelight, surrounded by the mingled sounds of their new, blended community, they danced. Their lives found a rhythm, like the music. In the morning, Eliza walked to the school. The sound of her reading and the children's recitations drifted down to the spring. In the afternoon, Atsa worked. He saw people in the small adobe that had been Dona Marisol's. He no longer scouted, he healed. His mother's knife, which Eliza kept sharp for him, was used to harvest the herbs he now grew in his own garden. He bound small wounds. He made poultices for aching joints. He listened. In the evenings, they sat together on the porch of their own house. They had a large, leather-bound ledger, the one the federal investigator had left behind. But they did not use it for money. By the light of a single lantern, they recorded the day, the rainfall, if any, the height of the corn, and, most important, the level of the Ojo. They had marked a measuring stick in the center of the spring. It was their science, their duty. It was the promise they had made to the water, to the land, and to each other. Eliza looked at her husband, his dark head bent over the page, his hand carefully marking a line. She thought of her father's letter. Choose your own way. She had come here seeking freedom, believing it was a kind of escape. She had been wrong. Freedom was not running from a life you did not want. It was the hard, brave, daily choice to stay, to build, and to care for the life you had chosen. Atsa looked up, his work done. He saw the way the lamplight softened her face. He had lived his life by the day, surviving, never planning. He had seen love as a spark, a dangerous, brief fire. But this was not a fire. This was a hearth. It was the steady, patient work of a long-term plan. It was consent, not just once, but every morning. It was a shared, quiet responsibility. The purple twilight deepened over the valley. The sky was a perfect, clear violet, reflected in the still, dark surface of the spring. The air was cool. Atsa held out his hand, palm up, across the small space between their chairs. Eliza looked at his hand. The strong fingers, the calloused palm. It was the same hand she had seen in the river. The hand that had asked her permission. The hand that had pulled her from the wreckage. The hand that had held her in the street. She lifted her own hand and placed it in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and sure. It was just as it had been that day on the riverbank. But this time, it was for a lifetime. From the town, faint on the evening breeze, they could hear the sound of Miguel's violin. And closer, from the Ojo itself, the constant, bubbling music of the spring. They belonged to this place, the place they had cared for, the place they had built together. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And if you really want to support us, please hit that hype button so this story can be heard by even more folks.